does this look?
This is History as I Remember It, where I pick a maybe random subject and quickly try and remember as much as I can about it. If you've come here for facts, you've come to the wrong place. But if you like getting the gist about a thing that may or may not be accurate, then strap in and feel the G's. Today's subject is the Atari Corporation. Unless it's not called that.
Maybe it's just called Atari Computers, or maybe it's called Atari Inc., or just Atari, or Atari Ltd. I don't know what it's really called, but that's what this episode's about.
Okay, Atari was most likely started around 1969 by most definitely Nolan Bushnell. He was probably going to college at the time because that's what they were doing, and he probably dropped out because you can't win while you're at college. So you would think that Pong was their first game, but I am not at all certain whether or not that is a factual statement to decline. So it was probably, he saw Space War, which was like this engineer-made game that played on an oscilloscope back when people weren't really thinking, let's make computer games. So it was kind of people who were just engineers who were messing around with stuff and probably being looked down on by older people for being too silly. But guess what? That silliness was an industry, and it was called computer games. So I am willing to bet that he probably did some sort of Space War clone. He probably saw that and was like, hey, like, we could sell this. Let's make Space War for bars and strip clubs and places where adults went, because video games weren't for kids at the time. They weren't for anybody because they weren't even invented yet. And you know what? I'm willing to bet probably wasn't trying to put it in the home because it was like way too expensive at the time. People didn't even have computers. Ralph Baer, I think 1972, Magnavox Odyssey debuted in the home, like way before you would think video games would be happening in the home. And it also wasn't very popular, but it was like something that was totally ahead of what people were trying to do. So I know Atari wasn't trying to put stuff in the home at that time. And Nolan Bushnell and Ralph Baer were enemies. Ralph Baer actually kind of invented Pong. Actually, I think he did invent Pong, but it wasn't called Pong at the time. And I think Nolan Bushnell saw that and was like, we can make this for the bars and strip clubs and all the places adults went to play games. And Ralph Baer was more of like an engineer. He held patents for things. He actually invented the things that he was selling. So it's kind of like if Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were friends, Ralph Baer and Nolan Bushnell were the opposite of that. So take that as a lesson. Be friends with everybody and use your friends to climb the ladder and be successful. But don't burn your bridges, because otherwise you'll just get into a patent war and you'll lose to Ralph Baer, because Ralph Baer actually owns patents for things you're using. And that's back when patents meant something, everybody. This was the 70s when people were still inventing things and not just like securing the rights to stuff because of whatever kind of bullshit that's happening today. Anyways, this is, whenever I get on a tangent, I'm going to use this little clapperboard. Boom. And am I going to clip my audio when I do that? No, we are resetting this scene because I'm doing this with one camera. This is a one camera thing. I don't know if this is really an easy video to do. It all depends on how good I do it in this thing. I don't know if you can appreciate how long it took me to elevate this up and make this set, which features very little Atari stuff. There's this invitation to programming, and there are these controls that are Atari controls. Why do I have HP computers holding up my lamps? Because they're both the same size. They look like the set, and I don't know, HP was a company in the 70s, but we're not talking about HP, we're talking about Atari, and I'm sure I'll show all my Atari stuff and a bunch of cool B-roll. There's a way I fill in between these cuts of things where I say things that don't make sense, but I keep talking because I've got to do this quickly and I can't stop and think about what I'm doing. I have no idea where this video is going. Right now we are somewhere between 1972 and 1977. When did Pong come out? I'm going to say 1974. I'm going to say Pong hit the arcades in 1974 and it was in the home by 1977. Oh yeah, you know what? Pong was like the paddles. Pong was not part of the Atari 2600, so Pong definitely was in the home by 1977. Guaranteed. And then they did the Atari 2600, and that was when they did games. Hey, they did more games. They did Pac-Man. Atari did Pac-Man. They did Pac-Man. I'm going to stick to that. Atari did Pac-Man. I'm sure they did a bunch of other games that were also like successful in between there, but that's where I'm jumping to. Arcades existed, by the way. They were just like mechanical. They were like things. Sega was an arcade company. They were doing arcade games in the 50s. Nintendo was an arcade company. I think they had evolved from playing cards. So was Atari like the first like computer game company? Like circuit boards? I mean, were there circuit boards in analog games? There had to have been, right? But they didn't have screens. So that's what I'm gonna say. They did games with screens, and Pong probably was the thing that was like, hey, everybody likes Pong. Even though, have you played Pong? It's not that fun. I don't know. Pong doesn't really hold my attention. Okay, so you got Pong, and then you have probably a bunch of other games, because you don't just go from Pong to Pac-Man. That's a pretty big leap. So they were making a bunch of arcade cabinets that were all really cool and space agey, and there's like these tables where you can put your drink in them, and they were really classy. And by the peak of disco, they were like, let's get stuff in the home. Atari 2600, very popular video game console. I believe the Magnavox Odyssey 2. Was there an Odyssey 2? Ah, man, I don't remember. We'll say the Odyssey 2. There's a follow-up, and so Nolan, Bushnell, Ralph Baer competing for the home.
Nolan, Bushnell won.
Atari 2600 was a very popular console, and then they decided to fire him at Atari because, I don't know, too much success. I'm sure he was probably doing some jerky things, but for whatever reason, Nolan Bushnell ended up out of Atari. So you get this new guy, and I don't remember his name. I don't know, we're gonna call him Ray Manzarek. We call him a real square. That's what they used to call them back then. And he basically was not likable by anybody. And what was happening is that video game publishers were promoting programmers like they were stars, like they were rock stars. Games came in these mini LP jackets. It was like having an album, and what ended up happening was a lot of people who worked at Atari ended up leaving and forming their own companies like Activision because they were just sick of what was happening in that they used to get credit for their work. And now whenever anybody wanted to interview or ask who did what, the whole thing was Atari Corporation did it, and nobody who works for Atari Corporation owns or deserves any credit for it because we pay people to do things for the face of Atari Corporation and a lot of things to really alienate people. So this guy, you know, he's probably competent in a basic sense, but not in a sense of the way computers are, which are a very competitive industry where everything has to be better every year and it's extremely competitive and people are willing to do work for less than what it's actually worth because they are so into it. So you don't alienate those people. That's why in the 90s, people were basically making work like super fun jail. Like, you want to be here. It's jail. You can't leave, but we're going to make it really fun for you. Okay, so this guy, Ray Manzarek, I know that's the keyboardist from The Doors. I'm just picking a name. I'm sure his name was Ray. I know his name was Ray. His name was Ray. The guy who was running Atari after Nolan Bushnell's name was Ray. So basically, they have to follow up the Atari 2600. And I believe the Atari 400 and 800 home computers came out in 1979, and they were very popular. And I know they were around for like 5 years, which is a very long time to produce a computer. And so in that time period, they had to follow up the Atari 2600 and they had to follow up the Atari 400 and 800 computers. So this guy's whole thing is like, well, let's ride this as long as we can. You know, programmers are replaceable. Who cares? People are going to buy it. It doesn't matter. Like, just churn it out. Churn it out. That is like the YouTube conundrum. Like, do I churn it out or do I put some effort into it? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that. But it didn't work for video games because in 1983, the market crashed because there were so many bad video games out there that people lost faith in the actual value of video games and they didn't want to buy video games anymore. It's like all the games. There were so many bad ones. You try and play Atari games now. You play like Space War for the Intellivision or whatever that thing was. It's impossible. Asteroids. Oh my God. Asteroids was probably an Atari game, unless it wasn't. But there was a ton of stuff like that. And was Asteroids Space War? I feel like Asteroids may have come before Pong, but that seems unlikely because Asteroids seems more complicated than Pong. But it would be easier to get Pong into the home because it's so simple. Okay, so I'm just remembering games like Centipede and Defender, and did I say this was going to be a complete and or accurate history? No, I didn't. This is not complete or accurate at all. This is just how it occurs to me. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, and that's the whole point of this. We are at 1983, and the video game market has crashed. And Nolan Bushnell is like, haha, losers, told you so. And I don't know what he was doing after that. I believe we are leaving Nolan Bushnell now, even though he has done a bunch of stuff after that. We're just gonna say Nintendo came in, increased standards, like people can't be trusted. You can't just let people run wild and do whatever they want to do in a market because most people are gonna crash that market into the ground. So what happens? Atari is always behind forever. And I think just now they are getting a nostalgic recognition. But for me, in the 90s, I went from an Atari 800 to a Sega Genesis for playing games. And it is like a whole new world. A whole new place of something new. No one to tell me no or where to go. It was a whole new world. I never looked back at Atari, and it actually felt kind of like, what? Like I was into those stick figures? Like, how sad. I looked back on Atari in like 94 when, actually almost immediately, but really 94 things were starting to get 3D and all this stuff that was like, we were heading in the direction of like, oh my God, like we are going to become the game. Like this is going to be full immersion. This is great. I don't think we've really even gotten there yet, but that's how it felt then. And Atari was like, to hear about the Atari Jaguar coming out, it was like, oh, first 64-bit console. And everyone's like, oh, but no, it's not really 64-bit. And it's like, those typical Atari liars. They don't really have anything good to provide, so they'll just lie to us. So it was just like written off right away, like no curiosity about it. And I am just snubbing everything that they're doing because they have lost it. Their brand is sour to me. 80s nostalgia has been big for, like, as far as I'm concerned, way too long. I sensed it. Like in 2008, people started like being kind of 80s. And I was like, I don't know about this. I remember the 80s. I remember Atari. I don't know, why would you want to go back there? And maybe in the past 5 years, we'll just say Stranger Things was like, whoa, the 80s. And then it's like, oh, well, that vintage Atari stuff and all those limitations they had to go through and how limitations create creativity and how you use your imagination to fill in that, and you're coming from nothing and you have something, and now it's all like that wood stained paneling and that beige boxes and all this earth tones. Oh my God, I had enough of earth tones. And by the 90s, I was like, give me matte black, give me blue LEDs, give me the future. I don't want any of that Atari. I don't want any of those earth tones. I don't want my fake wood panel TV. I want curves. I want things that are not pixelated. I don't want to see pixels. I want to see future. I want to see reality on a screen, and I want to go to that reality. I don't want to be in this reality. I feel like that was more like the 2000s, but at a certain point, you kind of got a feeling like, you know what? We could build a reality that's better than the reality that's here. And that was kind of a 90s thing. It was kind of like, oh, it's only getting better. It was getting better. It was like, wow, computers are getting better. If you're into computers, you were in for a delightful ride. If you weren't, you were probably so pissed off that I probably found enjoyment in it. Yeah, where are we going here? Is there an ending to this? Okay, so basically what happened, maybe all of that is a tangent, and I'm just gonna cut all of that. Okay, yeah, I'll probably end up cutting a lot of that, because that's not really about Atari. So today, historically speaking, Atari doesn't exist anymore. Atari was probably bankrupt by the 90s. I think the Jaguar was their last attempt to be relevant. And despite their prominence in the movie Blade Runner as a future corporation, they did not do it at all. And they went bankrupt, and their name was bought, And at this point, it's kind of a Khashoggi ship situation where it's like if you take all the parts of a thing and you replace them all, and you say, oh, yeah, no, that's Gerald. Is it really Gerald, though? Or did you just make something else and call it Gerald? I feel like that's what that is. I feel like that's what Khashoggi ship really is. Because really, if you totally replace all the parts of a person and you call that person the same name, well, there's a bunch of people who have the same name and they're not the same person. And that's what Atari is. Atari doesn't exist anymore. It's just a name that was bought. And people who own it make money now. That is like a long-term investment. To buy something, and who knows, I'm sure tons of people bought it. And the way things work, people just, I'm gonna blah, 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 and however many percent of this, and however many percent of that, and blah, blah, blah. I don't understand business. Whoever owns Atari right now is probably very happy because there's all this like retro consoles and stuff. And was the Atari 2600 a fun console? I don't think so. I have no interest in playing it, but they made a mini one. Go to play like old Atari games, they aren't very fun. You're dead in like, you're done, game over in like a minute. Like a lot of these games, they're sourced from the arcades. They're real quarter eaters. And people are like, oh man, people are getting used to these. How can we make these harder? I don't get that. I mean, I get it from a making money standpoint, but I don't get how people find that enjoyable. And that's what a lot of these games were. It was just like, oh, boom, I'm dead. That's not fun at all. You should not be able to have a game over in the first minute. Like it should be extremely, you should have to really try to get a game over in the first minute of a game. If your first level is, you're gone in a minute, that's not a fun game. No, I don't care what that game is, it's not fun. You can't even, you play Tetris, you can't game over if you just hold like, hey, while I'm watching it fall, you see it stack, you don't get game over in a minute. That's why Tetris is a fun game. Because you don't like just instantly lose. You can actually make mistakes and recover from them. There you go. If you're Atari right now, then you're feeling decent. But that's the end of my history of Atari. I have nothing else. Stay tuned for anything that isn't this.